All right, welcome everybody, and thank you all for joining today's webinar about consent conversations in clinical trials to explore what's changing and what's emerging. This is the second Consent Conversations webinar brought to you by the Palliative Care Clinical Studies Collaborative, or PaCCSC, and Cancer Symptom Trials, also known as CST, which are two member-based clinical trial collaborative groups. First, I'd like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, upon whose ancestral lands the University of Technology Sydney campus now stands. I'd like to pay respect to the elders, both past and present, acknowledging them as the traditional custodians of knowledge for this land. I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands from which all of our attendees join today, and to pay respects to those elders past and present. And I also extend this respect to First Nations people attending today. Before we get started, I'd like to highlight a couple of housekeeping matters. This session is going to be recorded, as we hope to have it available going forward. Please post your questions in the chat for discussion during the Q&A and panel, which will take place after all our guest presentations have concluded. We also ask that you keep your microphones on mute. Welcome again. My name is Charmaine Strauss, and I'm a senior project officer for the Impact Trials Coordination Centre at UTS. I work alongside a small but dedicated team to deliver high-quality investigator-led clinical trials emanating from our membership base of clinicians and researchers through the PaCCSC and CST collaboratives. Our trials aim to improve the evidence base for the care of people at the end of life and experiencing symptoms associated with cancer. Informed consent is a cornerstone of ethical clinical research. It ensures that participants understand the purpose, risks, benefits, and procedures of a trial before agreeing to take part, and is essential for upholding ethical standards and participant autonomy in clinical trials. Informed consent is evolving from a static form to a dynamic, participant-centered process, but its implementation is increasingly challenged by evolving research landscapes, regulatory shifts, and emerging technologies like artificial intelligence, or AI. With growing emphasis on inclusion, consent must also address cultural and linguistic diversity and digital literacy. Meanwhile, digital platforms and AI tools are reshaping how consent is delivered, offering personalized summaries and interactive formats. In short, informed consent is no longer just a signature. It's a living process that must adapt to technology, the evolving ethical and regulatory landscape, and participant needs. We have three subject matter experts presenting today who will touch on the changes to the informed consent requirements in ICH Good Clinical Practice E6 Revision 3, as well as emerging developments reshaping how consent is delivered and obtained. This will be followed by a Q&A session and panel discussion with all of our speakers. So let's jump straight in. Our first presenter is Dr. Sophie Meffem. Sophie is Global Executive Manager for Research with the oncology provider ICON Group and has extensive trial experience within the UK, Singapore, and Australia. Sophie will discuss the changes to the informed consent requirements in ICH GCP E6 Revision 3. Thank you, Sophie.
Thank you for the introduction, Charmaine, and for the opportunity to talk with your group today. It's a privilege to be here. I'm going to share my slides and then we can get going. And everybody see those slides okay? Should be coming up now. Take the 2 secs. Did everybody see those okay? Yep, okay. All right, so full screen. Again, thank you. It's a real pleasure to be able to talk to you about the changes to consent in R3. Somebody who's been involved in oncology clinical trials now for over 25 years. These changes are very welcome. I think they've been a very long time coming, and I think they will make the landscape much easier to navigate for our participants. However, they do also raise challenges, particularly around ensuring participant identity and participant privacy as we move forward with the new technology and the new ways in which informed consent can now be taken. So I'm going to talk you through, and when you see the slides laid out, I'm either highlighting the key areas, or I've also put on some slides in one color the wording that we had in R2, and then in a separate color the wording we now have in R3, because I think there are some very stark differences. So I want to start with the definition of informed consent as per R3, and I've highlighted in blue where we've seen the really significant changes. So let's just start with the standard definition according to GCP. I think most importantly, we have finally said goodbye to the word subject, which I think has been a very long time coming. Subject has disappeared completely from good clinical practice and has now finally been replaced by participant. But let's take a look at that first sentence. It is still a process. That has not changed. I think it's really important that when we're talking about consent, people are still aware that it is not just a signature on a piece of paper or an electronic document. It is always a process, and it continues to be a process as we go into R3. But obviously the first part I've highlighted there in blue is the change from subject to participant, and the focus on the fact that it is either the participant or their legally acceptable representative. So that's an update that we've seen as we go into this new definition. So the participant will voluntarily confirm willingness to participate in a trial. That hasn't changed, but the next section has. After they've been informed and been provided with the opportunity to discuss all aspects of the trial. So that's the insertion. And then back to the old word, that are relevant to their decision to participate. Now, these next 3 bullet points are so important in terms of changes. So the first one is we can now use varied approaches to how we provide information to our participant and how we discuss a clinical trial with our participant. And GCP goes as far as to say that we can use text in different formats, we can use images, we can use videos, and finally, we can use telephone and video conferencing with investigator site staff. We've needed this clarity, and I think a lot of what we're seeing here has actually come from COVID as well. That ability now to really use technology to engage. However, if we're going to be using telephone or video conferencing, we do need to think really carefully about participant privacy and how we're ensuring the identity of the person who has actually signed the consent form if we're using electronic mechanisms to do so. Big update here, the informed consent is documented by means of a written, and that in brackets, but very important, paper or electronic signed and dated informed consent form. But again, whilst it's fantastic that we've seen we can now use electronic signatures, where I work, for instance, we use DocuSign for all of our in-house admin processes, but we're already starting to think, well, if we're going to use DocuSign for informed consent and we haven't made the switch yet, how can we be sure that the person who has electronically signed at the other end, whether we've emailed it out or sent it out via a system, how do we know that that person is actually the right person? How do we know that we've directed it to the right person and that somebody else hasn't accessed that email, or it's been printed out and somebody else has got hold of it? We need to be really careful and spend time thinking about how we manage this, that it's done properly. And that's very much confirmed by point 3, obtaining consent remotely may be considered when appropriate. And I think GCP puts a lot of caveats in that. R3, we can only do it when it's appropriate. So we need to be thinking, and I think you'll see a lot of changes in your ethics submission processes. The section around how you describe consent, it's got to be appropriate, particularly for the participant, for their situation, for the diagnosis that they have, and how we're treating them or not, depending on where they are in the stage of their journey. Up the top, we've got the definition that used to exist in R2, and I've really underlined in terms of the oral and written information that we give to the patient or participant should be as non-technical as practical and should be understandable to the subject. There's that awful word that's gone, thank goodness, or their legally accepted representative. That phrase non-technical has been very clearly updated to the information should be as clear and concise as possible, We should use simple language and avoid unnecessary volume and complexity. Now, I think what is a really important point to highlight here is one of the changes in sponsor responsibilities that has come about as part of R3. There is actually a sponsor requirement now to ensure that protocol, patient information and consent form, and any other participant-facing information must be designed in conjunction with key stakeholders. And it goes further than that to say that should include the site staff, so people actually involved, so healthcare professionals who will be involved in the management of a clinical trial, but more importantly, the participants themselves. So the fact that GCP not only states that written information we're giving to our participants should be clear, concise, simple language, and unnecessary volume and complexity, it also goes further under roles and responsibilities to say sponsors must include those key stakeholders in the design of those documents. So I think really important, there are other parts of GCP that very much, I think, help to enforce some of the changes that we've seen coming out, particularly around consent in R3. Again, at the top, we've got what used to be there in green. So again, it's all written informed consent form, any other written information that we gave to the subjects, any revised written information, and just that really strong focus now in blue about varied approaches. So text, images, videos. I think videos are going to be a real game changer for us as we move forward, that ability to actually communicate with participants in a way that is much easier for them to understand, but actually the ability to use all kinds of different methods so we come up with a way that works best for the population that we're working with. I think this will actually be really important if we look at vulnerable groups, and how do we make sure that we're getting the information to them in a way that is understandable and relevant to the condition or the diagnosis that they have. Obtaining consent remotely, but again, I cannot stress enough the importance of how do we ensure and the investigator and any staff that have been delegated, how do we ensure the identity of the participant and the privacy of their information if we're flying things around via emails or DocuSign systems or anything similar? How do we ensure that there's no breach of privacy or data? This one's a really good update, and I think it reflects some of the changes we've seen in investigator responsibilities, where there is a very significant shift away to more people at a site level being able to take on additional roles that traditionally have been held by the investigator. So this update says the informed consent process should be conducted by the investigator or other investigator site staff delegated by the investigator in accordance with applicable regulatory requirements. So again, we're seeing the ability to actually have more people able to take informed consent when it's appropriate and when it's been supported by our local regulatory authorities. This is a really interesting update, and I've just highlighted this whole statement here is brand new in R3, but I think the word that I've changed the color and highlighted there. By signing the consent form, the investigator is confirming that the informed consent was freely given by the participant and the information was accurately explained to and apparently understood by the participant. Then the informed consent process obviously involve a physical or electronic signature and date. This is a brand new statement. I think it's quite powerful, and it's really important our investigators understand this. When they are signing the consent form and when the participant is signing, they are effectively confirming that they have accurately explained the information to the participant, but more importantly, they believe that it has been apparently understood by the participant. So I think some real thought around how are we going to ensure that as we go forward, particularly if we're doing remote consent and we're using more technology, video conferencing to manage the process. Written informed consent still needs to be updated. That hasn't changed, but I think some real clarity around the need for who needs to reconsent should be assessed and confirmed, and that new information clearly identified when we have new patient information and consent forms. So I think there's always been an issue when we've had a change to the patient information and consent form. Well, who needs to re-sign? Is it everybody who's currently on this study? Is it everybody who signs on to this study after this approval? Is it only people who are currently receiving treatment? Is it everybody who's ever taken this drug or intervention in their lifetime as part of the study? So that's always been a very big point of contention, I think. Nobody's ever known. Is ethics telling us? Is the sponsor telling us? It's actually very clearly clarified in R3 now that information should be clearly identified. So I think helpful in terms of how do we manage reconsent. And then vulnerable participants, the first two dot points haven't changed, but there's been an addition around age appropriate information must be provided to minors. Now, pediatric research is obviously a very specialized area, but I think it's really good to see it having gone in there, to see it in R3, that we must be giving age appropriate information and that we must reconsent those participants if they've entered a study as a minor and then reached the legal age of consent while they're on the clinical trial. So again, a very helpful update from a pediatric perspective. And I think, again, just a reminder, when we are working with vulnerable participants, particularly, for instance, if we've got participants who can't read or write, the impartial witness themselves can actually join us remotely. I think that's very helpful, particularly if we're looking about from interpreters. There's always been a need to clarify, is it okay to have the interpreters? Is it okay to have an impartial witness dial in and witness something? This should all make the consent process a lot more straightforward, but I think it also gives us clarity on areas in the consent that have been very grey in the past. And that's the end. Those are the key updates for consent as we move into R3.
Thank you, Sophie. Our second presenter today is Gordana Vasic. Gordana is the Manager of Healthcare Interpreter Service at Western Sydney Local Health District, a role that she has held since 2009. Gordana will discuss a practical example of engagement of interpreters in consent conversations that was implemented at Western Sydney LHD to improve clinical trial access to culturally and linguistically diverse patients. Thank you, Gordana. I will just share your slides.
Thank you very much, Charmaine. And thank you, Sophie, for this great presentation. I've learned a lot, although I'm not from a clinical background. I'm coming from New South Wales Health, from Western Sydney Local Health District, where I manage the healthcare interpreter service. And my presentation is about engaging interpreters in consent conversations. Can I have the next slide, please, Charmaine? Thank you. So in New South Wales Health, just as a way of a background, there are 5 healthcare interpreter services. We cover entire state, and Western Sydney Healthcare Interpreter Service is the largest metropolitan one. It's a 24/7 service, and we provide services in over 400 languages, sorry, around 100 languages, but we have over 400 interpreters. And we also have sign language interpreters or Auslan interpreters. The New South Wales Health Policy Directive mandates engagement of professional interpreters in all public health settings. And our interpreters are NAATI certified or NAATI recognized, which is national accreditation. NAATI is the National Accreditation Authority for Translators and Interpreters. Our interpreters are also highly trained and specialized in medical settings. They are bound by the Professional Code of Ethics. AUSIT Code of Ethics is for speaking interpreters, while ASLITA is for the Auslan interpreters. The next slide, please. Thank you. I'm going to share a success story from Western Sydney about our support to CALD patients' participation in clinical trials, and CALD stands for culturally and linguistically diverse. There are multiple obstacles for CALD participation in clinical trials, and just one of them is language. But from clinicians' perspective, we heard about some of perceived obstacles, such as it's hard to get access to interpreters, or it's too costly to engage interpreters, or it takes extended time for clinical sessions involving interpreters. Yes, it is true that there is a cost involved, but engaging interpreters is not going to break anybody's bank. And also, It is true that the sessions with interpreters do take double the time, but none of these reasons should be used for exclusion of CALD patients' participation in life-saving or life-prolonging clinical trials. So what we did in 2018 in Western Sydney, two of our teams, our clinical trials team and interpreter service, got together and we discussed how can we possibly make improvements in terms of engaging interpreters for clinical trials. So what we came up with was the priority booking system. To provide some context for you, for us in health, the priorities are emergency departments, ICUs or birth units, or any other emergencies. But for this purpose, for clinical trials, we put it at the same tier. It became our top priority. So for instance, if there is a Mandarin-speaking patient who is suitable for an upcoming trial, and that trial is offered to Westmead Hospital in 2 days' time, and mind you, Mandarin is the busiest language in Western Sydney, and it's so hard to get an interpreter on a short notice, yet we will make sure that we do everything possible to secure an interpreter for this patient in 2 days' time and for all subsequent consultations related to clinical trials. So the clinical trials team had to work with the clinicians to tell them that now there is a faster way to get interpreters and how to do it. So they managed to get the clinicians buy-in. And what we also ask clinicians when they book interpreters for consent consultations to send us the PICF, which is participant information and consent form. So that's helpful because we then allocate 1 hour to our interpreters to read through the PICF and do further research to prepare themselves better for the consultation. So the outcomes have been great. So we have managed to save and prolong some lives. It's also it also had a positive outcome for interpreters and clinicians in terms of training. Our model was inspiring New South Wales Cancer Institute, who worked with us on developing a dedicated training for interpreters about working in clinical trial settings. And the last year, we also worked together and we developed a training for clinicians working with interpreters in clinical trial settings. On the right-hand side, you can see the table that shows the number of interpreting sessions that we provided over the last 7 years in clinical trials. The start was very modest in 2018. COVID set us back naturally, but then it picked up in 2024, where we had great results. But we are actually going to outdo ourselves this year because for the 6 months of this year, we already had 98 interpreting sessions. Next slide, please. And this is something we are very proud of. You can see that we had 114 patients in 24 languages. And some of them have been participating in trials for 7, 6, 4, or 3 years. You can see this green patient had 17 interpreting sessions over the 7 years. And we are so proud of saving some lives or prolonging many lives through this pioneering model. Can I have the next slide, please? And now coming to the consent conversations, as you could see from our previous slide, it's very important to engage interpreters throughout the participant's journey, not just for the consent conversation. It's also important to provide the patient information and consent form to interpreter service when making a booking for a consent consultation. As I said, we will then give that to our interpreter to better prepare for the consultation. Yes, you have to allow more time for consultation that involve interpreters. And when you are in a consultation where interpreter is present, you have to provide the information to participants in a way that they will understand, meaning that through an interpreter, you will talk about the risks, you will talk about the benefits, and give them an opportunity to ask any questions if they have. Keep in mind that sometimes, because of cultural differences, you may need to allow your patient to consult their family or their GP. So it's a good idea to give them the PICF to take home, to read with their family or to consult the GP, and then book another session for a decision making. Also keep in mind that decision making is also a collective process in many cultures. So some of you may have heard your patients saying, I'm sorry, I can't make a decision. I have to have my daughter or my son present here. And one more important thing when working with interpreters in this setting, please brief them if you have a chance, and also debrief them. These sessions could be emotionally charged, and it's good for interpreters' well-being just to check on them after the session. And please remember, our interpreters, you can ask our interpreters about cultural concepts and beliefs. And just a few reminders, interpreters cannot do sight translation of long PICFs. Sight translation means that you are presented with a paper document, you read it, and then you interpret. So we can't be asked to do sight translations of PICFs. We can do small size translations. For example, the last page of the PICF is a short consent form. Yes, we can be asked to do that, but it has to be done in your presence because the patient may be asking some questions we won't be able to answer. And also, as Sophie already pointed in her presentation, interpreters cannot be a witness to patient signature on the consent part of the PICF. And again, to mention that yes, interpreters can provide information on cultural concepts and beliefs, but they do it without stereotyping. And that's all from me. Happy to take questions later on. Thank you.
Thank you, Gordana. And I now welcome our last speaker for today, who's Lana Tikhomirov. Lana is a final year PhD student at the Australian Institute for Machine Learning at the University of Adelaide. And Lana will present on the use of medical AI in the clinical setting with a focus on consent conversations. Thank you, Lana.
Thank you. Yep, just checking everybody can see that.
Yep, all good.
Perfect. So thanks for the introduction. Just quickly about myself. I have a Bachelor of Psychology with honours in something that's called human factors, which is basically how humans make decisions, especially high-risk, complicated decisions using algorithms and automated decision aids. And I've been really focusing on AI safety and decision-making for the past 4 years. And I use cognitive science as well as bioethics methods to look at AI in medical decision-making. So I don't like to assume that everybody starts on the same foot knowing what AI is. So I like to give a bit of an introduction. And that is that all that AI means is that it's a broad umbrella term, an aspirational term even, for machine learning and deep learning technologies, particularly deep learning. So deep learning makes use of big data sets to find patterns that fuel decisions. And that's what we use in the new AI age. So medical AI specifically generally falls into 3 categories. So the first is diagnostic, things such as imaging algorithms for detecting MRI pathologies. The second is prognostic, so alerts that detect when patients are at risk of sepsis. And the final one is administrative, so something like an ambient AI scribe that transcribes an interaction between a clinician and a patient. So something that I think is important to point out is that AI is an intervention, even at its most administrative stage. So almost every use of AI that is further than rote transcription is some form of intervention. And the reason for this being, is that large language models, which fuel almost all modern day ambient scribes, are not like natural language processing, which is more designed to do rote transcription, but they actually summarize the most clinically useful parts of that interaction. And it requires a certain level of interpretation and analysis by the AI, which can lead to clinical impact, but also certain safety risks. AI uses whatever information it deems statistically optimal for solving a problem. And that's in anything such as a large language model all the way to an imaging model. It's the same principle. We know that this can lead to incredible results, but sometimes to also deeply incorrect, implausible, biased, or even harmful results. And that's not to say that what can be isn't promising, because it certainly is. We know that robust, efficient, structured AI scribes, culturally sensitive ones even, with strong data privacy protections could dramatically improve administrative burden. Imaging algorithms are known to find abnormalities at really early stages, and well-tested alert algorithms could improve hospital efficiency and patient triage. But what ought is not what always is with AI. So as one example, the actual evidence toward AI scribes improving clinical burnout and reducing the time taken for that transcription is actually pretty sparse and at most very conflicting, even if clinicians feel better when using them, which is what we describe perceived versus actual use. And on a similar note, language translation LLMs can work for very, very simple sentences, overwhelmingly in translation to English, and is very heavily influenced by the data set, so often performs well in Chinese and English. But the literature is mixed, especially at an applied level, right? So actually looking at how it functions in real life with real life data in a hospital is very limited. So in the topic of consent, I wanted to bring up a case study about an AI researcher called Dr. Kobe Lines in Australia. And she just recently documented her experience where she took her child to see a certain specialist. The specialist asked for consent to use an AI scribe, but being an AI researcher, she had some serious concerns about the privacy and security of that particular company. So she declined, and then the specialist essentially denied the appointment and told her to find another practitioner. She then went to APRA, and they basically said there's nothing we can do, because it turns out that ambient scribes at the moment are not regulated by the TGA. They are very highly unregulated. Now, the TGA actually did release a few days ago their stance on AI scribes, which is that those of rote transcription don't need to be regulated by the TGA. Now, it's slightly unusual that they've given this information, as we know that almost all AI scribes at the moment are overwhelmingly not rote transcription, but rather clinical summarization, and they also sometimes prompt the clinician as well, which causes an interaction. So this also coupled with the fact that most hospitals or clinics deploy at their own level of evidence, it's not necessarily standardized. Also important to note that there is a lack of transparency from AI scribe companies around data and privacy, and we know that there are very real tangible risks with giving over confidential patient data to a company who may not comfortably share what they actually do with that data. So this situation in the bioethics literature is actually called a moral crumple zone, where the burden of responsibility is given on the patient, and it seems to be conflicting pieces of information everywhere as to who actually has that responsibility. So something that I think is important to keep in mind in the topic of consent and AI is that the level of evidence is extremely important. So research consent versus clinical consent are typically different things, but these lines can actually blur in AI, especially when sometimes we're still gathering evidence about the AI efficacy, even when it has been deployed and it's not in a research context. Most generative AI, so large language models, are algorithms that are architecturally designed to create information rather than to convey truth. That might change one day, but as it stands, that is just the way that they function. So there are reasons to have tangible concerns about AI performance, and this is often due to the low level of evidence that is tested and given for safe and deployable performance. So as a counter to that, I'd like to bring attention to something that we're doing at our institute, led by my supervisor, Dr. Melissa McCradden, who's the AI director at the Women's and Children's Hospital. And we investigate something called silent trials, which is basically where, say you have a sepsis algorithm, instead of deploying it straight in the hospital, you run it silently in the background, and it runs over all of the real life patients, and the doctor doesn't see it. So it doesn't influence their care. And then after a period of time, you can look at the performance, see where it failed, look at its scalability and some of the economic aspects, and then you can deploy. And then you know that there's a certain level of evidence that has been reached. And we do this through an international consortium with people like regulators, people from medicine, human factors, to produce best practice material. So something else I also want to highlight from some of the research we've been doing, the perspectives of youth on AI. So we sort of asked what youth could teach us about AI in healthcare, and we ran some qualitative contrastive vignette studies, the first in Canada, and then we're repeating here. Basically where we found from the early results from the Canadian cohort that youth believe themselves less likely to benefit from participating in medical research when the intervention is AI. So what's my point in really bringing this up? Well, when we actually think about the takeaways for consent and AI, we shouldn't take for granted that there is a lot of goodwill around AI and consumers, but that goodwill can diminish. Right, so there are very many instances, especially the more that we all experiment with AI and interact with it, where we know the very real and tangible risks that sometimes are not addressed, especially in our legislation and in our regulation. So we shouldn't take it for granted that we need to earn trust, especially through our consent process. So when it comes to actually giving informed consent, sometimes the way forward, rather than info dumping about AI or taking people to a long terms and conditions list about data and privacy, it's really about focusing on how the clinician maintains authority of the tool and data protection, or the researcher or the user, right? So we really want them to be informed. And further to that any AI with little or poor evidence is most likely just not ready for use. And if you as a consumer or a participant has doubts about that, then that's legitimate, because we should be able to provide them with that. Now, obviously in a research context, that's different if we're looking to get evidence about a tool, but all the same principles apply, right, with focusing on authority of the tool, etc. And finally, I would say to really beware of coercion effects. So avoiding power dynamics. I myself have had situations, and I'm sure a few of us have now, where you go into a doctor's office and they ask you for consent to use an AI scribe, for instance. Well, that actually technically should go to the receptionist or the administrator, so that you don't feel pressured into consenting, especially if you feel that you might disappoint them or something like that. So we really want to be aware that AI is an intervention. We don't always know the level of evidence that somebody has for deploying it. And we should be really mindful that we are allowing people the autonomy to opt out in these situations. So I think I will stop it for there, but I'm excited for questions later.
Thank you, Lana, Gordana, and Sophie. Those were some great presentations. So the remainder of our session is going to be a Q&A and a panel discussion, and we'll work through some of the questions in the chat if there are any. And if you have any questions, please pop them in the chat and we can get to them. I can see lots of discussion in the chat there. Thank you for sharing your document, Sophie. I know that's an excellent comparison of R2 and the changes in R3. But maybe while we wait for people to maybe formulate some questions, I might have a couple for you to get things started. I might start with you, Sophie. Now that R3 is encouraging digital technologies, what kind of safeguards do you think should be in place to ensure that if we are able to do electronic consent, that those platforms maintain some sort of ethical and regulatory integrity across diverse trial settings?
Yeah, look, it's a really good question. I think I probably started to touch on it when I was going through my presentation. If we look at the updates to section 4 of R3, it's there's a brand new section in there on data governance and computerized systems, and there's a very significant section in there around participant privacy, ensuring integrity and reliability of data, but also under investigator responsibilities, I said about the investigator must be assured of the identity of the participant if they're going to be using remote systems. So I think we have to take a breath before we jump into this. Many of us will be used to using systems like DocuSign for our own internal contract signing. But as I said, if we can't just start using DocuSign for consent, we've got to make sure we've got safeguards. How do we ensure that the person signing is actually the person that we want them to be? You know, we're going to start really close discussions around things like two-factor authentication. I think your IT departments are going to become your best friends if you're going to start implementing these processes. But you're also going to need to think about your cybersecurity. You're going to need to start thinking about the governance in your organizations around patient privacy. But I think it's going to be, yes, the updates are great. Don't rush into them. Spend some time thinking. If I was to email this document to one of my participants, how do I actually know that the person who has opened that document, and let's say, for instance, printed it out and signed it, how do we know it's actually that person?
That's, yeah, excellent points, definitely. It's very difficult these days, and privacy and confidentiality are very big topics.
But this section needs to be read very closely in conjunction with data governance and computerized systems, which is a brand new update in R3.
Thank you, Sophie. I think I've seen a comment from somebody on the line. Hi, Sophie. I realized that the TGA hasn't ratified R3 as yet a sponsor recently asked us to provide them with an R3 GCP certificate. I assume R2 is relevant for now. For how long?
Whoever asked that question, did you see the update from the TGA on Thursday last week? Before I answer that question, because they have finally given an update on R3, acknowledging that R3 is on its way. The public consultation is out. Final comments have to be in by, I think there's a date in October, and R3 will go live in January 2026. But they have been very clear. And in fact, I spoke to a senior GCP inspector at the ARCS conference a couple of months ago. They've made it very clear they have no issue with people transitioning to R3 training. They're very aware. Certainly where I work, we're getting 3 or 4 emails a week from sponsors and CROs asking us to provide GCP R3 training, which we're rolling out. The only caveat really that the TGA have said is that if you were selected for a TGA GCP compliance inspection, you would be inspected against R2 until January 2026. But they have been very clear, and they've even said, I think, on their website that they have no issue with people transitioning to R3. They're aware of the pressures a lot of us are under to transition. We've started transitioning. All of my staff at ICON are transitioning to R3. The pressure is too great from our sponsors to not do it now.
Great, thank you.
Great that we had the update last week, finally.
Yes, I think we all cheered when we saw that come through.
Yes.
Maybe I'll ask a question. Oh, but if a doctor has recently done R2, should they already retrain in R3?
That's an organization decision.
Yeah, very much so.
Your organization will tell you the plan for transitioning staff to R3.
Thank you. I might move on and ask Gordana a question now. I know you touched on, one of the things that the interpreters can do, and that's advise on cultural aspects. How do cultural differences, how do they affect interpretation in consent? What are some of the things that I guess you need to consider when you are interpreting during a consent process?
Yeah, it's probably important it's more important to say that the clinicians should be aware that when they are seeing the patients from cultural background, that some cultural contexts and beliefs and customs may influence patients' decision making or understanding of the process, and this is where the interpreters can be of assistance. So clinicians can approach interpreter prior to the session and ask for some cultural background. If during a consultation something came up and they need to clarify it after the consultation with the interpreter, they can do it. But there might be even times when during a consultation, a cultural values or beliefs appear to be an obstacle for understanding. And in that case, interpreter can ask the patient for permission to flag this with the clinician, and then they can clarify that through the dialogue, providing that the interpreter at all times keeps both parties informed of what is being said. There are numerous cultural differences, and in this context, it could be stigma and taboo about clinical trials. Then clinicians should be aware that perhaps discussing the prognosis may be disrespectful or even harmful in some cultures. Also, they should be aware that in some cultures, doctors have unquestionable authority, which can then reflect through the way patients use indirect communication style rather than direct that we are used to in Western world. For example, they may not be responsive to the questions. They may be nodding, which is not going to be a sign of comprehension, but rather a sign of respect for authority. And as I already touched on, decision-making, in many cultures, it's actually, it's a collective process rather than individual decisions. So it's important to be aware of that. And it's also one more thing, it's a challenge in these sessions that in many languages, there are no equivalents for certain terms used in clinical trials. And in many languages, a trial might be interpreted as an experiment. So it's always good to have a chat with an interpreter before the session to check on terms commonly used or whether the equivalents are missing in order to decide what is the best way to discuss it with the patient in a session.
Wonderful. Thank you, Gordana. That's very helpful. I can see Pratama has a comment. She wants clarification on pre-screening data prior to consent. Can de-identified pre-screening data be provided to sponsors to understand recruitment trends? This data does not include any medical information. I think this might be a question for you, Sophie.
Yeah, a really good question. Bellbury actually have done a big piece on this recently. They came back to us. We used Bellbury as our ethics committee. They actually have concerns about people doing this. I think the way we've done this is actually to go back and get ethics approval to do it. That's the way we felt most comfortable. We went back and actually said, this is what we're doing. This is what we've been asked to provide. And either putting it in as part of the initial HREG submission or going back subsequently and saying the sponsor is now asking us for this information. Because even though there's no medical information in there, it's still participant information. And with this big focus on participant privacy, I think it is worth getting HREC review for that. That's what I would recommend. That's certainly what we did when the same is. And I know more and more sponsors are asking for this kind of information, but we were more comfortable with an HREC overview and approval for this.
Thank you, Sophie. I might ask you a question, Lana. Let's touch on some AI, I think. Maybe what are some of the ways where AI tools can enhance or undermine the ethical integrity of the informed consent process, particularly if it's being layered with interpreter-mediated communication?
Yes, that is a very good question. So if the clinician is the person that is accountable for verifying that consent was obtained, which is often the case, and you get, for instance, a large language model that mistranslates something into a language that the clinician doesn't understand, then the clinician's not in a position to establish with any certainty that, in fact, informed consent was obtained, which is, you know, a big legal risk as well as potential harm to the patient. And really with translation algorithms, this is where you really do want to be quite careful, just based on our current knowledge of their performance, but also the fact that, like, there are very real cases, especially from, I hear at the hospitals with my supervisor, that, you know, you can have a use case where a large language model swapped what not to do during a stroke with what to do during a stroke. And then, you know, other instances where, you know, 10 milligrams 3 times a day turns into 100 milligrams 3 times a day, and things like that. That's not to say that there are definitely AI tools that are really good at this particular process that are refined and trained. For instance, this is more of a simple example, but ones that take medically complicated text and generate accessible text for patients, and the clinician can ensure that it's correct if it's in the same language, and reduces like the burden to translate medical jargon. But in terms of other languages, I'd say that we're still really getting there in that. But really understanding the content being produced by AI is important, especially if we assume that the clinician has some sort of duty around actually understanding and having autonomy over that tool, which should always be the case.
Great, thank you. Are there any other questions? Please put them in the chat if you'd like to ask something. Laura commented, Sophie, I love the updated wording around avoiding unnecessary volume in consent forms. Do you think this will help with institutes reducing 20-page plus consent forms?
Yes, number one, I do. But I think this goes hand in hand with another one of the updates that we've seen under sponsor responsibilities, which I absolutely love. It actually says in GCP now that sponsors must ensure that their protocols and essential records, and these are the terminologies they use, are operationally feasible and do not, and they avoid unnecessary complexity or burden on the investigator and the participants. That's a GCP requirement for a sponsor now. I would say 35 plus pages of PICF, which is what we often see in oncology, absolutely is placing a burden on our on our participants and our investigators, and doesn't make a study operationally feasible for a start when we're spending all that time. So the unnecessary complexity component of that sponsor update absolutely applies to the crazy length that we see some PICFs coming out to now. But it's the responsibility of us as sites to go back to sponsors and use the terminology. This PICF is going to place unnecessary burden on my participants, and actually being strong enough to say, I don't think that this PICF meets GCPR3 guidelines. Certainly that's what we're starting to do, particularly with protocols that we're starting to see that are looking far too complex, and from our perspective aren't operationally feasible. So the changes are there, but sites have got to feel empowered to have those open dialogues with sponsors. So I think there's quite a few changes in R3 that will help us to really start to shift the length of some of these PICFs. Not unusual for us in ICON to see them over 35 pages long. It's not sustainable.
Yeah, definitely. Just some question that popped into my head. Do you see, Sophie and maybe Lana, do you think AI could be used to make these, or some other technologies? How can we make the process of explaining information much more simpler, and then ultimately help to reduce, the size of those PICFs? We can make use of some technologies to achieve that, I suppose. Is that something that you see could be happening in the future? I know GCPR3 doesn't actually address AI at all. That's one of the things that it addresses systems, but not specifically the use of AI. No.
I think, yes, it could if you do it in conjunction with investigator site staff and the participants. That's the key now. R3 clearly states that stakeholders have to be involved. Sponsors have a responsibility to involve stakeholders in protocol, PICF, any patient-facing, even down to quality of life, PROs. participants should be involved in all of them. So yeah, I think if we use AI, but participants are part of that process, then I think it could potentially have a role. What would concern me is if it was used without participant engagement. I think that's really important. We have to be designing documents for participants by participants. That's been missing for far too long, I think.
Thank you. Lana, any other comments about that?
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with that. Large language models are generally like information extractors, especially large language models. I guess it's just making sure that the information that you find important, that patients find important, is what is summarized by the AI, and because it is, you know, acting by its own design about what's clinically relevant or useful. And just knowing that the responsibility, it's not going to fall onto the AI, will fall onto the user. And if there's misunderstandings there, just to really understand where the liability chain falls.
Great. Thank you. I think we might, with 3 minutes to go, I might just wrap up for today. I just want to thank you all for your thoughtful contributions today. Thank you everybody for joining. It's been quite a jam-packed hour filled with insightful and thought-provoking presentations from 3 experts in the field. As we wrap up, let's reflect on the evolving landscape of informed consent in clinical research, a space where ethics, equity, and innovation are converging. Sophie began by unpacking the changes in GCP E6 Revision 3, which reframed consent as a dynamic participant-centered process. Gordana then explored the critical role of interpreters in bridging access for culturally and linguistically diverse communities. Language discordance isn't just a communication barrier, it's a barrier to equity, safety, and inclusion. Finally, Lana stepped us through the frontier of AI in the clinical setting, including applications in consent. AI offers promising tools to simplify complex information and enhance participant understanding. It's important to remember that informed consent is not a checkbox, it's a cornerstone of ethical research. Whether through regulatory reform, inclusive practices, or digital innovation, the primary goal remains the same: to empower every participant with clarity, dignity, and a choice. We hope that our presenters encourage you to continue having these conversations within your own teams and workplaces regarding consent in clinical trials to enable future directions and improvements. To close, this webinar has been brought to you by the Palliative Care Clinical Studies Collaborative and the Cancer Symptoms Trials Collaborative, conducted through the Centre for Improving Palliative Aged and Chronic Care through Clinical Research and Translation, also known as IMPACT at UTS. These collaboratives are member-based and free to join. If you are interested in learning more about our work or becoming a member, please follow the link in the chat. We would love to hear from you. Thank you again for your engagement, and especially to our 3 invited speakers today for joining us. We all hope that you have a wonderful day. Thank you.
Thank you for the invite.
Thank you for having us.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.